They thought they knew Clint Eastwood. By the mid-60s, the world had already seen the poncho, the hat, the slow walk, and the stare that could cut through stone. To most people, he was the man with no name, a myth projected on a screen. But the story you're about to hear didn't happen in a script meeting or on a soundstage. It happened far away from the cameras, on a strip of hard, sunburned land where there were no second takes, no stunt doubles, and nothing between life and death but a man's decision to stay or ride away. It was the spring of 1966, during a break in filming one of the Italian westerns that would brand his face into movie history. The crew was working on the outskirts of a forgotten village, miles from the nearest highway. At noon, the set emptied like a drained glass. Grips, extras, stuntmen all headed toward the catering tents or whatever shade they could find. Clint saddled a small bay horse, the wranglers used for stand-ins, and rode in the opposite direction, away from the chatter, away from the director's arguments about lenses and angles. He didn't go far. He didn't have to. You don't have to ride for hours in the desert to find something that's been abandoned. The land behind the village dropped into a shallow ravine choked with pale stones and stubborn weeds. The only sound out there was the dry whisper of wind and the faint metallic clink of the horse's bit. Clint let the reins hang loose and listened. People who worked with him always said the same thing. He was quiet, too quiet for an actor, as if he spent more time listening for something inside the silence than for lines on a page. That was probably why he heard it. Before the horse did at first, it didn't even sound like an animal. It was a thin, broken noise, like someone dragging a bow across a violin with the strings about to snap. The bay's ears flicked forward. Clint turned his head, eyes narrowing into the sunlight, and heard it again. A weak, strangled whinny, more breath than sound. He swung down from the saddle and tied the reins to a scrub of twisted brush. "Easy, boy," he murmured, more to the unseen animal than to the horse behind him, and started toward the sound at the bottom of the ravine, half hidden by a scatter of rocks. Lay a foal could not have been more than a few weeks old. Its coat was the color of dusty copper, too fine, too clean for this place. One foreleg was bent at an angle no leg was meant to take. The animal had tried to stand. That much was obvious from the long scars cut into the dust, but the limb had folded under it again and again until it no longer tried. The foal's chest trembled with every breath. One ear twitched. The other hung limp. The first thought that passes through your mind in a moment like that is simple and selfish. Turn around. Go back. This is not your problem. You are an actor on a lunch break, not a rancher with time to spare and a vet on call. You have lines to remember. You have a long afternoon of dust and gun smoke ahead of you. The grown-up thing to do is to walk away and tell yourself that nature is cruel, and there's nothing you can do. Clint just stood there, looking at the animal. Later, when people on the crew told this story to each other, they would always stop here and ask the same question. Why didn't he leave? Why didn't he call for one of the wranglers and let them make the hard choice? Why did a man who made a living pretending to be a hero decide, in that forgotten ravine, to act like one when nobody was watching? The foal tried to lift its head as he approached and failed. Its eyes were huge and dark, framed by lashes still rimmed with the dust of birth. They fixed on him not with trust, not with fear, but with a kind of dazed, exhausted curiosity, as if the animal itself could not believe it was still breathing. "Easy," he said again. Crouching beside it, there was no one else in that gully. No cameras, no sound men, no publicist waiting to spin this into a story about what a compassionate star he was. There was just a man, a wounded foal, and the heat pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck. He ran his palm gently along the animal's neck. The skin was hot, too hot. Fever had already moved in. Flies hovered at the edges of the wound where the leg had broken through the skin. He brushed them away with the back of his hand and felt the foal shudder. You know that moment in every Western, where the rancher looks at a suffering horse, then at the gun on his hip, and you already understand what must happen? That scene exists because someone, somewhere, lived it. Clint knew that. He had played that choice in front of cameras, had squinted into the lens with a face made of stone, and pretended to be the man who pulls the trigger for mercy. Now, there was no director to yell cut. If you had been standing there in that ravine, what would you have done? Would you have whispered an apology, drawn the gun, ended the animal's pain, and told yourself it was kinder that way? Or would you have walked away and let time do the job you could not bring yourself to finish? He did neither. Instead, Clint slipped off his poncho and folded it into a rough pad. He slid it under the foal's head so the bones would not grind against the stones. The foal's breath came fast and shallow against the fabric, warming the place where, an hour later, he was supposed to be wearing it under the lights. From the top of the ravine, the bay nickered, impatient. The lunch break would end soon. Someone would notice the star was missing. Somewhere up there, a first assistant director was checking his watch, ready to send a runner. Down here time had narrowed to the space between one breath and the next. Clint studied the broken leg. He had grown up around horses enough to recognize what he was seeing. This was not a clean fracture that might be mended with splints and rest. The bone had punched through the skin and dragged in dirt. Infection was not a possibility. It was already a resident setting up camp. Even if he somehow convinced the wranglers to try, even if they hauled the foal back toward the village and found a vet, there was every chance the animal would die slowly, painfully, and he would have only prolonged the suffering. Still, his hand stayed where it was on the foal's neck. There are stories about Clint Eastwood's silence, how he could make a single word sound like a full sentence, and an unreadable look carry the weight of an entire monologue. In that ravine, the silence wasn't a performance. It was him testing every thought, every instinct, against something he didn't have a name for yet. Finally, he exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the heat out of his lungs. "Not today," he said. The foal's ear flicked. Just once, as if that phrase were a command it understood. He untied the bay and led him carefully down the slope, talking to both animals as if they were part of the same fragile deal he was making with the universe. Then he did something that, on paper, makes no sense. He started figuring out how to get a half-wild, injured foal out of a stone ravine with nothing but a stand-in horse, a poncho, and however many minutes were left before the crew came looking. That was the moment the legend of the little horse they later called Dust really began. Though, of course, nobody on the set knew it yet. To them, it was just another day on location. The only person who understood that the day had quietly split his life into a before and an after was the man in the hat, standing alone in the bright, merciless sun, refusing to walk away. They say every decision a man makes becomes a story, but the ones he makes when no one is watching, those turn into legends. Clint didn't know he was writing one that afternoon. He only knew that a small life lay in the dirt, and he was the only one who had a chance to keep it breathing. The sun was sliding lower, sharpening the edges of every rock. Time wasn't his friend. He looped the bay's reins tight and tried to figure out the impossible, how to move a creature that couldn't move itself. He knelt again, slid his arms under the foal's chest. The animal let out a sound that was half terror, half relief. Clint gritted his teeth as he lifted Dust weighed more than he looked. The foal trembled violently, its good legs kicking weakly at the air. "Easy. I've got you," Clint murmured. The climb out of the ravine was slow and brutal. Clint used his back, his legs, every muscle he could command. The ground shifted under his boots, sliding stones that could have sent them both tumbling. Several times he stopped, breathing hard, letting the foal rest its head against his shoulder. Dust's heart thudded against his chest like a frightened drum dot. By the time they reached level ground, the bay was pacing nervously. Clint couldn't blame him. Something about the air had changed quieter, too quiet. Silence out here never meant peace. It meant something was listening. Coyotes. He saw them before he heard them. 3 shadows cresting the far ridge, curious at first, then hungry. Narrow snouts pointed toward the scent of fresh blood. They began to descend, trotting low, tails stiff. Clint's jaw tightened. He set the foal down gently and stood between Dust and the advancing shapes. His hand slid inside his coat. No prop weapons now. This was the one he kept for after dark, when filming wrapped in places that didn't feel safe. The gun came out smooth. He fired one shot into the air. The crack tore the silence apart. 2 coyotes veered, startled. The third kept coming, teeth bared, eyes locked on the easy kill behind the tall man. Clint's second shot hit the dirt inches in front of its paws. The animal froze, ears flat. A long moment passed, then it turned and bolted, swallowed by the rocks and heat. Only after they disappeared did Clint realize how hard his pulse was pounding. He turned, checked the foal. Dust's breath came shallow and fast again. Fear took energy he didn't have to spare. "Not yet," Clint whispered. "You hear me?" "Not yet." He tied Dust carefully to the bay, using strips torn from the lining of his poncho, and fashioned a sling of sorts. It wasn't perfect. Hell, it barely made sense. But it allowed the foal to lean against the bigger animal's flank. Letting the bay carry most of the weight, Clint took the lead rope and started walking. Every few steps he looked back, making sure Dust wasn't slipping. The foal's hooves dragged grooves in the earth behind them. Clint didn't let himself imagine what would happen if Dust collapsed completely. The village came into view, whitewashed walls, camera cranes peeking like curious birds, crew members moving like insects in the growing heat. By the time he reached the edge of the set, sweat had soaked through Clint's shirt. People turned when they saw him. First confusion, then disbelief. The wrangler was the first to speak. "Where the hell did that thing come from?" "Ravine," Clint answered, voice hoarse. "Broken leg." "He needs help." The wrangler shook his head. "Too young. Too far gone. We put him down and move on." Something dark flickered in Clint's eyes. Not anger, something colder. "No," he said. "We try first." The wrangler laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You ain't a rancher, Eastwood. You're an actor. That horse is done." Clint stepped forward, closing the space between them until the man's smirk faded. There was nothing in Clint's face, no raised voice, no threat spoken. Just that stare, the one critics wrote pages about, the one audience members tried to imitate in mirrors. Up close, it didn't look like performance. It looked like a verdict. "We try first," Clint repeated. And just like that, the wrangler backed down. Word spread fast. A few crew members brought water and cloth. Someone offered iodine. Clint worked in silence, cleaning the wound, washing away dirt and blood. Dust whimpered only once, a small sound, like an apology. A makeup assistant watched, arms folded. "I thought you didn't like animals much," she said. Clint didn't look up. "I don't like seeing anything give up." They improvised a splint from 2 pieces of crate wood. It wasn't pretty, but it held. Dust laid his head against Clint's knee when it was done, eyes half closed. Exhaustion finally claimed him. Clint stroked the foal's ears with a gentleness few had ever seen from him. "You just hang on, kid," he murmured. "We're not finished." For the rest of the shoot that day, Clint was different. He hit his marks, fired his blanks, rode like he always rode, but between takes his attention kept drifting toward the small stable they'd set up behind the catering tents, toward the small life that depended on whether he kept showing up. When filming wrapped, most of the crew scattered into the village for drinks. Clint stayed. He sat on an overturned bucket near dusk, watching the foal breathe. Night crept in, cool at first, then bitingly cold. The night shift guard wandered by, raising a curious eyebrow. "You're going to freeze out here with a horse that doesn't even belong to you." Clint didn't move. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. He wasn't talking to the guard. He was talking to dust, because somewhere between that ravine and this stable, the foal had become something else. Not a burden. Not a lost cause. He had become Clint's responsibility. The guard shrugged and shuffled away. Clint reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small piece of sugar the catering crew kept for coffee, and held it near the foal's mouth. Dust sniffed, hesitated, then licked it from his palm. "Good," Clint whispered. "You keep trying. I'll keep trying." Behind him, the set lights dimmed one by one until only the stars were left. Somewhere far away, a coyote cried into the darkness. Dust twitched but didn't wake. Clint stayed awake for hours, shoulders squared against the cold, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't know it, yet not fully, but the moment he refused to walk away, something had changed. Something about the way the world would treat him. Something about the way fate would one day pay back the debt he had just earned. He thought he had rescued a foal. He had no idea the foal would rescue him right back.